in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the SECAcast. This is Fred Iantorno, Executive Director of SECA. Today's presentation will provide a summary of the changes and additions to the BMS in Release 2015 R1. Today, Dan Webster will present those changes and additions. Dan Webster is a senior architect at Mitchell International, specializing in trading partner integrations. Dan has worked on auto physical damage integrations for over 20 years and enjoyed an insider's view of the collision industry's transition from proprietary communication protocols and data formats to today's more standardized environment. Dan is also co-chair of the Architecture Committee. I want to thank you for spending your time with us today, and to our presenter for sharing his insight and expertise with all of us. I will now turn this over to our presenter, Dan Webster of Mitchell International.
Thank you, Fred. Good day to you all. I'm very happy to present what we've done in the last 6 months with the BMS and the release that we put out in the last quarter, 2015 R1. We didn't have a lot of activity this time around, so I'm going to take just a little bit of time to go through a few changes and then take the opportunity to share with you the new initiatives that will make the release process go faster, even when we do have a lot of changes with the new QA regime that we're following. 2015 R1 is the day and the release number, or the year and the release number of our latest release, and I'm working with the assumption that some of you might be using this as your first introduction to BMS. So a release package consists of 3 elements right there under the overview bullet: the BMS itself, the business message suite, the code lists, and the schemas for validating XML and defining a document. The BMS changes by functional area we will go over today, the code table changes, and as I referred to a little earlier, the QA plan announcement and implementation. We've been working with BMS for since 2003 was our first release, and the BMS stands for, or stood for, Business Message Specifications, but we've got a bigger focus now to everything we're doing with the business messages, and the whole release package has been renamed the Business Message Suite. The BMS is organized into sections with a Section 1, Welcome and Overview, Section 2, the Rules and Definitions, Section 3, Common Elements and Aggregates, and then Section 4 through 18, where we do a whole lot of our work, is the SECA messages themselves that trading partners exchange with one another. And those sections are numbered 4 through 18, although if you're not looking at the Word document, it's not the numbers of the sections that are important, but it goes through the services from assignment, estimate, disposition, attachment, to the newer ones: parts and material, repair orders, vehicle repair, status, authorization service, invoice statement and remittance service, location, survey, valuation, title service, claim service, status service, and our newest arrival, the appointment service. The organization of each of these sections, as well mirroring the BMS document itself, pardon me, is that each section has an introduction and has aggregates that are common only to that section, and then the request messages and response messages. And we have gotten pretty involved with the XML technology and specifics of it over the years, and we're starting to rethink the generic quality of the messages when we have the new JSON committee I'll talk about later. But all of our messages have similar organization in that they are requests, and each request has a response in the name of the message. The code lists are really a huge part of what a standards body is all about. The idea is that when trading partners want to refer to something, they want to use the exact same vocabulary for it, and we got introduced to this from the world of EDI and our EMS standard, which might have had 20 code lists in the 15 years ago, but we've now got 180 code tables, and in front of the 180 code tables is an index page that names them all, says the date they were most recently maintained, and gives you a hyperlink index once you know the name of one to jump to it. The last worksheet is very important as we enter our 12th year of maintenance of this thing, to know what we changed, and sometimes we can get a vision of why from our change log. And then in between there are all the 180 code tables. We've also started consolidating these, or we've got a lot of debate in this mature stage of our standard is about what codes are preferred when we've allowed duplicate ones to get in there, which ones are obsolete, but we just marked them as obsolete and they're still accepted in the standard from a XML validation perspective. Then the documents that are quite important for the implementers are the XML schemas. These describe the actual XML documents that trading partners would exchange, and they describe them in the sense that there are many automated packages that will use these as input and build a database, an implementation, an object model, and the other thing they can be used for is to validate documents to get an instant read of whether a document you've been presented conforms with the standard schema that you've agreed to with your trading partner. And with that in mind, we started out for the first several years of Sika having a classic code list schema. Well, we had a schema that when it came time for our code list, we didn't actually enforce that the documents used only codes from the code list, and it was just a gentleman's agreement that you're supposed to use values that are in those code lists. And we started just a few years back strictifying the schema where the actual definitions of the fields in the XML schema included the code enumerations in it, such that documents that used unregistered codes would be considered invalid when you did a schema validation. And maintaining this and testing it is a big part of what we do now, but it is possible to test it now as it never was before. On the other hand, the classic code list is still there for implementations that would be constrained unduly by the strictified version. So with a little background into what the BMS is, how it's organized, how it works, we'll talk about the handful of changes we had in 2015 R1, which we tested and released at a meeting in Columbus, Ohio in April. The committees that submitted the changes were VDI, Vehicle Damage and Imaging, RPI, Recycled Parts and Inventory, and the Scheduling Committee. And those changes were to Section 3, the Common Aggregate. We added a Vehicle Database num to the Vehicle Description Aggregate. So in addition to a database code specific to the estimating system vendors, they're paired with a database vehicle number. The message impact is that any messages that use the vehicle info aggregate, the parent of vehicle description, in the new version of 5.1 and going forward, can use the vehicle database num element. In the appointment event common aggregate, we added an assignment priority such that the messages appointment inquiry, selected appointment add requests, and appointment confirmation add requests could have assignments having a priority. Also in the section 3, in the quoted parts aggregate, we changed quoted part to repeating. And this is something that happens. We'll go through and add things to the schema in one release and find out surprisingly often that we need to worry a little more about whether they can repeat, whether they're optional, that sort of thing. So the change here was that the quoted part could happen multiple times over the course of a quoted parts aggregate, and that would be impact to the procurement add request and the procurement doc type quote. Assignment was changed by the scheduling and VDI committees to add an assignment priority, and we already talked about that. But that caused in order to have that field, it had to be populated with code values, which were put in the assignment priority code table and the assignment status code table. And we also made changes to the service status code, all of these requested by VDI. So as I described, we have 180 tables in the, or tabs in the code list spreadsheet, and they turn out to be named types in the schema. And this is often how it goes. You add a new element, you want the element to be backed up with the code list, and the schema and the code list table grows. But it certainly grows less than would the many separate one-to-one trading partner relationships that want to do new things. So in the code list changes, we've made VDI was a little bit busy making additions to the assignment labor type, the material type, the rate type, the total type. State province had some changes. Vehicle services and charges had changes. I think we'll go over what those changes were. If not, I could answer questions about it. I don't have total recall of our big code list changes. But to talk about what we do when we get these changes, I'll talk about what happens at one of these QA sessions. And we definitely encourage you to volunteer your time and come join us at these sessions. I think the next one's in Bloomington, Illinois in October. But they're especially helpful for the members that are requesting changes that want to really be sure what they've requested is getting in there and going to work before it comes out in a release. But we always audit the changes of the BMS, the code list, and the schema. We verify that the three of them are synchronized, and then we discuss architecture issues such as guidelines of how and when we make changes, what the codes should look like as a pattern, guidelines for building the schema, and lately with the added excitement around using JSON, we talk about implications for JSON and the JSON schema development. The other things about our sessions are, so we get requests one by one from committees who work it out in a committee meeting, and Charlie brings those to the QA sessions in drafts of the Word document and of the code list, and we then ensure that the Word document specification of how our messages are going to look is what actually gets into the schema, and we often sit in front of 3 different projectors showing the Word document description of what we say we're going to do, what we're actually doing in the schema, and the support for that in the code list. And then we build it into a schema, and that gives us the opportunity to actually do live tests because we've got the BMS changes with the code tables in them. And what you can do is take sample documents that worked before and make sure they still work with a backward compatibility or regression test. And most importantly, the requesters of new messages provide us with an example, or if they don't, we make one as best we can figure out from what they've requested and what we've approved for testing, and then we actually submit it to a validating parser and find out whether they're valid. And this is very useful because one session's new tests of the messages that have been requested become a member of the test bed for future instances. And also, we find the shortcomings in what we requested, what we wrote about in Microsoft Word, what we decided to put in a code list in Excel. When you actually try to make a message in valid XML, try it with the various integrated development environments for XML, and then validate it. And it's just very useful to have these things at a live session. And those of you who have been doing this for a few years, I'm sure, can appreciate the wisdom of this, because in the past we would often have a request in one of our twice yearly releases. We would make the additions, and the next time there would be a change requested because the requester actually tried what we had added on their behalf and found it not to be workable. And now that can still happen, but we've had great success in finding errors, sometimes even calling or emailing the requesters from our QA meeting to get their help in finding out what we should really do. So that is our what has become more or less routine for us, maintaining a huge XML schema for these many, many messages, having code lists, and then testing them regularly, keeping these things in sync. It's quite amazing to think how routine this is when we think about the early days when we were converting the standards and the people who worked on the standards to understand XML and its various peculiarities. And now we get to do it all over again because JSON is a emerging standard that is very interesting to members of SICA these days. JSON is the JavaScript object notation, often called XML Lite now, and the practitioners of it are enjoy the same moral superiority over us XML developers that we thought we had 15 years ago over the old-style EDI folks. The JSON schema development even takes it to the point of when XML schemas were not available and there was a document type definition defining a XML message but not in XML, and over the years we got a standard from the World Wide Web Consortium of how to do XML schema, and we've built our whole standard around that. And it isn't quite there yet. We're in this same early stage with JSON where there isn't a formally standardized agreement of how to describe a JSON instance in a way that can be validated. So we're not only converting and working our BMS standard into JSON, but we're working with the broader JSON community on different proposals for JSON schema itself and how to use it, and those things all have to come together in the next months and years. And we have some go-getters associated with SICA who are taking that on very actively, right up to the point of having a open source project initiated for JSON schema development. And we're using GitHub, open to any developer. I'm not sure if we have any news about any developers who aren't our committee members from SICA that are using it, but it is set up in that way that is very popular and delivering results all across the industries that we're in. The JSON schema development is moving into its third year, I believe, and we had our first face-to-face JSON-focused meeting last October in Colorado Springs, and the things that we have been doing involved manually converting the section 3 of the BMS and the schemas, the common aggregates and elements, from a XML definition to a JSON definition, and then converting the whole XML schema to JSON schema. The process of that has manual schema conversion continuing, and after section 3 is finished, we plan to move on to the schema message conversion. Among the things we're finding is that JSON doesn't have an answer for matching XML in every case. And I think they're unapologetic about that. It's a new modern way of doing things and doesn't always match. But the things that we have used liberally, we're very accustomed to in our schema development and isn't available in JSON include the multiple choice options, not multiple choice options, but rather choice options repeated multiple times. The JSON technology doesn't support that very well, and we're trying to figure workarounds for the cases that we've done that in the BMS. Choice options followed by choice options that's what we're saying. And then sequence does not exist, and this was, I'm not sure we've all really come to grips with what this means for us, but almost everything in the SICA BMS is presented in our specification as a table in Microsoft Word, and it shows you the elements you'll expect to be grouped together, and it shows the order in which they're grouped, and that's the way we've always thought about it. That's how it works, and that's what XML specifies. And if you've been in the business of making sample messages and then real implementations, you know the first thing you've got to do is organize your elements in the same order that they appear in the specification and in the schema. And JSON doesn't concern itself with that. You just put your list of elements, child elements, to a parent aggregate, and it looks very much like what we've got in our BMS and in our XML schema. The difference is they're not surrounded by a sequence before an end tag, and in fact, JSON doesn't care if you put them in the same order or not. So what we are finding is that you convert a XML message to JSON, everything's in the right order, and it's valid in JSON validation. But if you take something that is valid in JSON, which potentially could have all of the elements in a scrambled order, that is not valid in XML. And the two things that might happen there is the emerging JSON technology might introduce a sequence. I don't think we're counting on that. And then our new brethren from the JSON side of the house are asking us, does SICA really care whether things in an aggregate or in a certain order? And is there a way in XML schema to banish the sequence construct? And those are the kind of things we grapple with on the JSON committee and on the architecture committee. So I've given you a little overview of how the schema and current BMS and code lists are organized, what we changed this time around in release 2015 R1, and then the exciting new initiatives for JSON, and we'll move on to the part about what we're working on to get approved for this meeting in October, which we will call 2015 Release 2. Pardon me. The subrogation remittance message is that committee is getting together to work on the responsible party to subrogation vendor to demanding party, and demanding party to subrogation vendor messages. The parts and materials procurement and recycled parts and inventory groups are working on a inventory message, recall data points, and assembly development. And this news about recalls in the automotive industry is getting a lot of attention these days, and we're seeing that in SECA with how we're going to mark parts and their relationship to various recalls that are going on. So that's talk that's happening in recycled parts and inventory, parts and material procurement, and we hope will be presented as proposals for things to put in the SECA BMS within the next month or two. So that pretty much concludes what I can tell you about what's new in 2015 R1 with the SECA BMS. And I think Fred will now tell us what's up with SECA in general in the coming weeks and months.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you to our audience for participating. I would like to summarize the educational offerings. On July 28th, we have a presentation of the value of reusable code. Then on August 18th, we have the new first notice of loss technology that will be presented. Followed on October 20th with Inside the SECA committees, which will go through each of the committees and what's going on within each of those. And then rounding off and ending the year on November 17th, what's new in the 2015 R2 release package. Also, the important event of the year, the 7th annual symposium and conference, will be held on September 14th through the 16th in Tampa. We've got a great lineup of speakers and topics. I encourage everyone to register as soon as possible. I want to thank you and have a great day, and we'll see you again on July 28th.